kommunistische Organisation. Podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the podcast of Kommunistische Organisation. Today we are here with Ella Rule, the chair of CPGB-ML, the Communist Party in Great Britain. And we're very happy to have the opportunity to talk to you and get to know a bit more about the situation in the UK and also the history of your party maybe. And maybe you want to introduce yourself shortly to our audience.
I'm just the chair of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist Leninist. I was a founder member of the party 20 years ago. But I've been involved in the communist movement since 1970. So a lot of experience, a lot of water under the bridge.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we start off with the recent topic because there have been the general elections in Great Britain.
Yeah.
And the Tories were defeated by Labour Party in the elections, which we of course know doesn't change a lot.
That was very much predicted, yeah.
Yeah. So, but besides of Labour Party, there was also the Workers' Party who was running for elections, and they didn't manage to get a seat, or Galloway was also not able to
retain his
seat. But they campaigned a lot for Palestine, and they were able to get some votes, even though the election system, it didn't turn into seats.
Yeah, 2 million.
Yeah. So we were wondering, because you were also supporting the Workers' Party, and CPGB-ML played an important role in the Workers' Party.
In setting it up, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how would you evaluate the role of Workers' Party now? Like, what are its limitations, but also their progressive potential?
Well, they have very, very good positions, as you mentioned, both on Palestine and on NATO and the war in the Ukraine. They're supportive of Russia in that war. And that is just amazing in British politics, that a serious organisation takes those positions. Unfortunately, they're very much focused on elections and electoral politics. And I think they rather feel that they are going to get fewer seats if the communists are seen to be supporting them. So basically, our relations have become more distant, but our position is definitely to continue to support them. If in elections we supported them, some of our people went and helped them with campaigning. We were very happy with that. But we would support any party that was taking progressive positions on those two questions at this particular moment in time. But as it happens, they're the only ones, so we've got no choice. We had to support them.
Yeah, it's interesting. We didn't plan this question, but I think you'll be able to answer it because I was wondering about the rest of the communist movement in Great Britain and the question how CPGB-ML is maybe working with them or not. And yesterday a lot of comrades told me that CPB still supports voting for Labour. Yep. So maybe you can shortly explain that, because
I can't explain how they bring themselves to do it, quite honestly. And in fact, I said to someone that I know is sort of close to the CPB but not actually a member, and I was talking about a particular person. Do you suppose he's going to hold his nose and vote for Labour? And the waspish reply I got, he won't even hold his nose. But I mean, the CPB is, and the new Communist Party, to the extent it still exists, just mad about voting Labour. They really think that the way to get socialism in Britain is to vote in a Labour government in which they're hoping that there would be a left-wing majority which would pass laws in the bourgeois parliament that would effectively bring Britain to socialism. I mean, basically, they haven't abandoned the line that was dictated by Khrushchev. That there's no need for violent revolution. You should use the electoral process in order to gain power. But of course, we know that winning an election, even being the Prime Minister, it doesn't give you power. The power is with the ruling class, and the people who are elected to Parliament do as they're told. No question about it. There was great hopes at the time that Jeremy Corbyn was around because he had a few sort of relatively left-wing policies on nationalisation. He started out as anti-NATO and pro-Palestine, but he toned those down because he wanted to be elected and he wanted to be Prime Minister. So people should really have noticed that, had he been elected, he would hardly have been what they were hoping. But of course, the ruling class couldn't even cope with the idea that they might be expected to pay a little bit more to improve the living conditions of workers, and they maintained a campaign to keep him out. They brought this question of his supposed anti-Semitism because he was pro-Palestine, and he caved in. The anti-Semitism was supposed to be rife in the Labour Party. Now, I'm not very fond of the Labour Party, but I can be absolutely sure that there's less anti-Semitism in the Labour Party than in any other bourgeois party in this country. But they had a big campaign to bring down Jeremy Corbyn, and of course they succeeded. As a result of that, during that campaign, a whole load of Trotskyite and revisionist groups sort of, sent their members in vast numbers to go and help Jeremy with his campaign. There were huge illusions. And when we cooperated in forming the Workers' Party, we could see that people disillusioned because Jeremy Corbyn was not going to be the Prime Minister, and he'd been prevented in the most bureaucratic and horrible way of being the Prime Minister. It had taught them a lesson about the nature of bourgeois politics, and we thought, right, that people will be looking for an alternative. George Galloway, who was very much opposed to the Labour Party, seemed to be a good alternative, where we hoped that we could cooperate, help him in his electoral processes and all the rest of it. And we, on the other hand, would be pointing out the lessons to be learnt from that situation and hoping that people would be interested in joining the Communist Party. Because, we had no objection to people belonging to both the Workers' Party and the Communist Party. In fact, our members all joined the Workers' Party at that stage. But as I say, the problem always with working with people who's focused on elections is the communists aren't popular because, the bourgeoisie conducted a very successful anti-communist campaign. Everybody thinks the communists are terrible monsters, and then in elections you don't want to be too close to them. So this obviously caused some difficulties. But still, it has to be admitted that the Workers' Party is a strong anti-NATO party and a strong pro-Palestine party, and that's all to the good. Yeah, let's see what this next year's bring, if Labour is in power and people hopefully finally see that they are not supporting Palestine. Well, they know. Everyone knows they don't support Palestine. Yeah. I don't think that lesson needs to be learnt, but there's this hope that somehow things might get better, but of course they won't. In fact, we've been getting the news recently that the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, has been opening up the books and seeing that the Tories have left such a terrible mess, that contrary to what we've promised, we're going to have to raise the taxes. I mean, and this is, they've hardly been there a week and they're already saying, well, forget about our election promises.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of difficult to understand that there's a party calling themselves communist that still supports voting for Labour for this party that is clearly not even social democrat.
No, not at all. It's awful.
Okay, so this is the electoral side, where it's also interesting to look at the situation because it's a bit different from Germany because we have another political system when it comes to elections. But I mean, still, we have the same phenomenon that every time when the election comes up, there's this huge front created against the right-wing parties, and everyone is telling you to vote again for the Greens and the Left Party, who are just the biggest warmongers. Yeah. And but we don't have any communist parties to do that, or at least not the big ones. But apart from this side of politics, maybe we can also look at the situation of the working class in Great Britain. Of course, there has been the cost of living crisis here, like in Germany, like in all the countries, everywhere. And I mean, from the outside, from Germany, where we have a really slow union movement and really like backing down to the huge companies and not pulling up big demands. For us, it looked like there has been a huge movement here in unionizing and people protesting and striking, especially in the health sector. And there has also been a lot of repression. There was this strike act that was introduced.
Oh, yes.
So maybe you can tell us a bit more about it, but also how does it influence the workers' movement, and how did the people react to it?
Yeah, well, what you have to understand about the workers' movement and the union movement generally is that it is firmly under the control of the Labour Party, and in fact, the Labour Party controls such progressive organisations as Stop the War, and so that basically here's the Labour Party conducting the war, and the Labour people, as the big names in the Stop the War movement. You can work it out for yourself what a disaster that is. So because, the unions are so firmly under the control of the Labour Party, they have never been able to conduct any kind of a struggle against the anti-union legislation. And after Thatcher, there was provision of statute after statute after statute reducing the power of the workers. So, for instance, it's illegal to picket anywhere other than your own place of work. So you can't. There can be no solidarity action, for instance. That was banned, and then a huge amount of bureaucracy goes on how you conduct the votes to actually hold a strike. So that was imposed as well. So it's almost impossible. Various weeks' notice have to be given of your intention to call a strike. I mean, it's unbelievable, really. And really there's been no resistance. And since these laws were passed, there's been the Labour Party in government that promises to repeal them until it gets into power, and then it doesn't. So quite honestly, this latest wheeze that we will be able to serve, or the unions will be able to be required to serve notice on certain workers that they can't go on strike because we've got to maintain public services. That's just more of the same, and you can expect that there'll be virtually no resistance to it, as there hasn't been to any of the other anti-union legislation. So the unions have to be controlled by the Labour Party, and they're left to be pretty toothless. I mean, obviously there was mass anger at the rapid fall in living standards, with the rise of the energy prices. People were being left in a very, very difficult situation, and that was what gave rise to these strikes. But you can see that they've been petered out. They've more or less just disappeared, without, for the most part, gaining much. There have been increases in salaries. There had to be, obviously, because they couldn't leave the people starving. But nevertheless, nothing much came of it. It was so exciting at the time. But, you know, I went out, for instance, to talk to the pickets at the local railway stations. There weren't any. There weren't any. I couldn't believe it. So even this whole question of how you organise the strikes is very, very poor, you know.
You mean in the sense that if there's a strike, the people want
the Labour Party controls the unions, and therefore there's no organisation to take place to make sure that there are pickets. There were pickets in some of the major stations in London, but out here, where the commuters all come from, and where there's a chance to actually talk to people, not a single one. I mean, that's how bad the union movement is in this country. And of course, all our members who join the union, if they get an opportunity to raise issues, they do. But very little opportunity arises, you know. It's very, very difficult.
So there wasn't really an increase in organization in the unions due to the cost of living crisis?
No, not really. In fact, all I can imagine is that people will be even more disillusioned with their unions than they were before.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we have all the questions of wages and cost of living and so on, which is of course connected to the question of war and of where the government spends the money for. And so there have been huge pro-Palestine marches here, and I was wondering so you said there's barely any union movement, so maybe it's not the question to ask, but has there been any connection between protesting the low wages and the higher costs of living?
Hardly anyway. You know, occasionally people will point it out, but it's not generally a battle cry, which it ought to be.
So there wasn't like workers protesting in their workforce against the stance?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I'm not saying that it didn't happen anywhere.
But not in huge...
No, certainly not in huge. And then, of course, the media is very selective in what it reports. And one of the problems is, that the Workers' Party had was there was a complete media silence on the Workers' Party. So, I mean, George Galloway is at least as prominent a figure as the right-wing Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage got lots of publicity, invited on to television shows and all sorts. Workers' Party, nothing. So, you know, there's a great deal of control over people through the media. Of the information that's given and the information that's withheld. That must be the same in Germany.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they don't support on a lot of things, and if they don't report on a lot of things, and if they report on it, they call all the people going on the streets too much for Palestine anti-Semites and so on. Terrorists.
But one thing you would have found shocking is that Julian Assange was in a high security, really unpleasant prison in this country without being charged with any criminal offence. He was there for 5 or 6 years and he was ill. Did the National Union of Journalists come out and take any action? No, not a single person was there from the union to support him. Is that believable even? You know, even though they themselves under threat that whenever they have exposed the crimes of imperialism, that they could find themselves similarly. But no, by and large they just follow their orders, and they don't.
Yeah. So, do you see any consciousness maybe within the pro-Palestine protests to combine those struggles? Or do you think it's not there yet to raise those questions of how to broaden the movement and to also really combine it with the... I mean, there have been other wars that Britain waged and supported, and there are a lot of people here with immigration background from countries that NATO has destroyed, and I mean, they are mostly the ones suffering the most from the high costs of living.
Yeah, but as I say, we're only a very small party. We do our best to, get people to join the dots. But how successful we can be while we're still so small is obviously limited. But yes, for some people, they say it's like the lights come on and they see it and then they join the party, and that's very good.
So, and your party also has been in the center of repression for being active for Palestine under the Terrorism Act.
That's right.
Luckily, those charges have been dropped, but maybe you can quickly tell us what was going on. And
so it was clear that they had some sort of agreement with the Israelis to try and put down the resistance to the policies, the pro-Israeli policies on Palestine, and the then Home Secretary was very keen to use force to shut the demonstrations down. I mean, they're quite expensive for the bourgeoisie to police these demonstrations because they have to pay the policemen all the overtime. So they'd prefer it if people would just stay at home rather than, make a nuisance of themselves. But obviously when you've got a demonstration of 1 million people, you can't arrest everybody. And so they try and pick on certain people in order to be able to frighten the others. And they picked on us on 2 occasions. One was a demonstration in December where they accused us of spreading racial hatred because we had the Star of David symbol intertwined with a swastika on the front of our book. And 4 of our comrades were arrested. They were kept in the police cells overnight. And then they were let out on bail, but with conditions, they couldn't travel abroad and things like that.
Even couldn't take part in protests,
and couldn't take part in protests, couldn't set foot in the Westminster, which is where the protests normally take place. One of them was a 16-year-old. A marvellous chap. He wasn't the slightest bit worried about it. Not as much as we were, actually.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they were the first batch, 4 of them. Then later, I've forgotten, which month was it, Christina? Do you remember? That when the second batch were targeted, and that was under the Terrorism Act. And this was because in the leaflet we had explaining this situation, a reference was made to the Al-Aqsa flood. So now the leaflet was very carefully drawn. We didn't say we support Hamas. We just said we support the Palestinian resistance, and we referred to the attack that was made by the Palestinian resistance in Israel on the 7th of October. We referred to it as the Al-Aqsa flood. Now, they tried to claim that this was demonstrated support for Hamas because it was Hamas that had called that uprising or that action the Al-Aqsa flood. I mean, it was just an excuse to, try and intimidate. And so 3 people were arrested. And, the problem with being arrested is they take away your mobile phones and they try and they're not going to find anything very exciting on the mobile phones, but you're left without that facility for weeks before you get it back. And they raid people's houses, they take their computers.
Yeah.
And so you have to be prepared for that nowadays. Make sure if you go to a demonstration, any computers, store them elsewhere where they won't be found. But anyway, they were arrested, and then the next day we went along to the police station in Hammersmith to protest about these arrests. They're totally ridiculous. And while we were there was one of these Israeli spotters, or Zionist spotters, who pointed to Ranjit, and 6 large policemen came down the road and they put him in handcuffs. You know, he was there with this little boy, 4 years old, and they put him in handcuffs, hauled him away, and he was joined with the other 3 in being accused of terrorism. 8 large policemen arrived here. They turned over the house over looking for evidence of terrorism. And of course, no, we don't have a bomb-making factory.
Yeah.
So they found nothing of any great interest. And I was in the police station and I said, look, don't you have any burglaries in Hammersmith? Do you have to arrest innocent people to practice on? I humiliated them as much as I can. Then we tried to get news of, when our comrades would be released, because the first 3 definitely were supposed to be released that day, and that's why we'd gone down to the police station. They said, no, we can't tell you, we don't know. I said, oh, are you waiting for instructions from the Israeli embassy? They were very annoyed when I said that. But anyway... But again, they hadn't got a leg to stand on. First of all, putting Hamas on the list of terrorist organisations, well, it was done without consulting anyone. And
when was it done in Britain?
It was only just sometime early late last year, last year. It's been done fairly recently.
Same in Germany.
Yeah, and. And it's an organisation that's supported by all the people of Palestine. You might not like it, but that's the fact of the matter. Secondly, the idea that we support them. Well, we're a communist organisation. We don't support any religious organisation. We don't send them any money. We don't send them what support? It's just ridiculous. But do we agree with the Palestinian right to defend themselves against the Israeli occupation? Of course we do. But that it doesn't just equal support for Hamas.
Yeah, we see the same in Germany, that the government is trying to split the movement on the question of resistance, and they're really targeting especially those groups that are really vocal and clear about supporting the whole resistance. And I also think your brochure on Zionism is really important also for our German audience to read, because this research about where Zionism comes from and why it can't be confused to be that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, it's really important, because our governments use those talking points a lot, and the Israelis are of course trying to push those talking points as well, but it's just not the same. But
the Jewish Voice for Peace in America are doing a great job in rallying Jews against Zionism. Fantastic. They've filled the capital. You get very little news about it, but they're doing wonders. And of course we have the very religious Jews who are opposed to Zionism, and they come on all our demonstrations. So we get all these things in the press about how frightened the Jews are to go out in the streets of London because of the anti-Semitism. But you can go wearing full Jewish regalia, you can go on a pro-Palestine demonstration and everybody welcomes you with open arms. So there's no question that people are going to discriminate against you just because you're Jewish, but they're not going to like it if you're Zionist.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question on the raidings of homes and these terrorism acts. Are there any charges left for your comrades?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment.
No. But
so there was no real evidence found, of course.
Of course.
And this terrorism act was just used to pressure you, to scare you.
Yeah, and to frighten others as well, of course. We got some comment from people who had left us not too long ago, a sort of suggesting that we were deliberately trying to get ourselves arrested in order to... because actually it had the effect of popularising our organisation. Our sales of pamphlets and books and things went through the roof, you know.
Yeah. I also think it's really important that you fought the legal war, legal war against it and made it public, because as you say, those measures are also supposed to frighten people to get active, to get involved in the struggle, and so I think it's really important to show people that in the end, as long as we still have some of the democratic rights left, they can't do anything about it.
But as I say, we've just seen poor old Julian Assange 5 years in prison in this country, and very little done to get him out. It was gross. But I think the Supreme Court must have said, look, you know, we really can't be seen to fly in the face of international law here. And I think they're very quiet about it. It was all done behind the scenes, but finally he did get out. But it's a bit much when you have to take things right up to the Supreme Court before anyone is brave enough to say, well, this won't do.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe then switching to another part of our questions for you. We talked about the trade union movement, and we talked about the pro-Palestinian movement, recently quite big on the streets. And you also published an important pamphlet on class analysis. So we asked ourselves beforehand whether you see the most important parts of the working class organized now, or where's the most important work to do for you now to organize the working class? Which are the most important struggles to get to for your party?
Yeah, well, it's very early days, but basically you focus on the advanced workers. So these, in terms of building the party, if you don't have a big, strong party, your ability to influence the broad masses of the workers is very limited. So because we're still small, then the focus is very much on attracting the advanced workers. And by advanced workers, we mean people who are prepared to go out on demonstrations, people who are prepared to go out on strike, people who are prepared to say, well, you know, things aren't right, we must do something about it. Now, these advanced workers are surrounded by opportunist organisations, trots and revisionists, who try and grab them and have often got much bigger organisations than we have. So, for instance, the trots can normally get hold of students and who are idealistic and want to change things, and the trots get them and basically teach them that capitalism is horrible, but socialism is worse, and look how awful the Soviet Union was. And that sort of keeps them away from becoming properly militant. And of course the revisionists and the link with the Labour Party, this grabs people who want to do something and says, well, you know, what we need to do is work in the unions. Well, in the unions you don't get anywhere unless you're a member of the Labour Party, and if you want to have influence in the unions, then you've got to have a position, and you won't get a position unless the Labour Party supports you. So, you know, we battle, if you like, against opportunism day and night, because they're the ones who are depriving us of the advanced workers that we need. But at the same time, you know, we do try and get our message out more widely. If there is an election, well, you know, very often we'll look for ways in which we can go around and knock on doorsteps and talk to ordinary people. It's good to find out what's going on in the world and how people are thinking. But our priority always has to be the advanced workers and getting them in the party, getting them organised, getting them trained.
Yeah. So, and as we talked already about, you're also active in the Palestinian movement and joining rallies, etc., having your stalls there and selling pamphlets, giving away flyers. So do you see some interest from the pro-Palestinian movement as well?
But definitely.
In the CPGB-ML or maybe at first in your content?
Yes, it takes time for people to come around to, overcome their prejudice against communists. Even when they see the communists on their side, you can't expect to talk to people today and tomorrow they just jump in and, however persuasive you are, people have to reorganize their minds for you to be acceptable, and this is tends to be quite a slow process. And obviously, in the course of it, there's a lot of pressure not to change their minds in the way that we like. So, yeah, you have to be a little bit patient, I think. But one thing about this crisis is that where the ruling class, from its imperialist super profits, has directed the bribes, it has been at the workers who are skilled and what we tend to call the petty bourgeois intellectuals, even though they are wage workers actually, but nevertheless, because of the prejudices they bring with them, we call them petty bourgeois. And these are the people who get a comfortable standard of living. But they're bribed because in a way they're the most dangerous for the bourgeoisie, or potentially the most dangerous, because they usually, their skills are very important. Without them, without the skilled workers, the factory will stop. They can't be easily replaced, and so they've got much more bargaining power than ordinary unskilled workers. So as they're pressed down on the living standards of these people that they've been bribing in the past, then you're going to find people who've really got into the habit of class collaborationist thinking actually beginning to wonder whether they backed the right horse here. So again, it's going to be a slow process because you've got to undo such a lot before you can become a revolutionary. But I can see that it's a process, that now that this huge pressure that hasn't been known for 100 years on the better off workers is coming. It'll be interesting to see actually to what extent relatively talented people will be attracted to the movement. One hopes that there'll be a reasonable number that are able to discard their prejudices. But we'll have to wait and see. We'll do our best to persuade them, obviously.
So with all the developments, we had inflation, we have the Ukraine war, genocide in Gaza, Labour got elected now, but we also had the perspective that for the whole working class, the living conditions will get worse and worse. Yeah. And now what you have mentioned, would you expect that the middle class, so to say, the petty bourgeois, is going to fall down into the working class, and maybe you can enrich the movement by this?
Well, that's more or less what I've been saying. Not so much the petty bourgeois, the skilled workers, both skilled with the mind and skilled with the hand, who have been the ones who in the past have been most bought off. But they're bound to have to, once they're relegated to the ranks of the ordinary workers, and they're left in big difficulties too, because they've got mortgages and they've got cars, they've got expectations of a standard of living that's being snatched away from them. So it may well be that begins to make them think a bit. And as I say, they're talented people, and if they are capable of discarding their prejudices, they'll be very useful for the movement. But it's not very easy to discard your prejudices, I promise you. It's not easy at all. But, there's the necessity. There's an economic crisis in the world, and capitalism has no way out. So, with these protesting workers wanting to maintain their wages and their living standards, and the government having to meet them at least part of the way, but they can't afford to do it. They have to borrow money from the financiers, and then once they borrow the money to improve things, then they have to pay the interest. So in future years, there's even less possibility of maintaining a good standard of living for everyone, because so much money is going to the financiers by way of interest. Now, obviously, if you had socialism, that wouldn't be a problem, because the surplus created by the workers would belong to the workers. It wouldn't belong to financiers who can lend it to you and demand interest. But people have to realise that money is still very poorly understood.
I think your answers just paved the way for maybe next block of questions here. We would like to get to know more about the current role of the British imperialism. We heard the bribing of the workers, etc. just before. So we would like to understand your evaluation of British imperialism at the moment. So it's been a few years since the Brexit happened already. Maybe we could start off with the question: how did this affect the role of the British imperialism in
well,
the
obviously,
world?
Brexit was a disaster for British imperialism. I mean, it was a Conservative government that said we could have a referendum on Brexit, and they really thought they'd get away with it, and that the British public could be persuaded by the media and the fact that we were already in the European Union, and therefore, who wants change, so that they were really astonished that they lost the vote on the referendum. Our position was, because the European Union was just an imperialist outfit to strengthen the power of imperialism, we were very happy for it to be defeated. But we did warn that the defeat of British imperialism, the defeat of in the referendum, so that we had to be removed from the European Union, that would make matters difficult for imperialism, and that they would try and take the losses out on the working class. And we had no pretense. There were people who, and probably most people who voted to leave the European Union, thought that we'd be better off if we didn't have to pay whatever the European Union. But of course we weren't better off, and there was no question of us being better off. One had to vote to leave the European Union the same way as if someone were to give you the vote as to whether we left NATO. Well, of course we would support the vote to leave NATO as well. So that that was a huge misjudgment on the part of the ruling class. And then the amusing thing thereafter was that the Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May came up with a wonderful plan for a no-exit Brexit, you see. But Boris Johnson, the public school boy who thinks he owns the world, he wanted the job of Prime Minister, and so he led a charge against Theresa May, and here she was insisting that this is the only way to save British imperialism, and nobody would listen to her. They made a mockery of her. It's quite funny. And then, of course, we got Boris Johnson, and what an embarrassment he was. There you are. So, they weren't even able to save a few scraps by at least staying in the customs union, which would have been, just about tolerable. As it is, they've really shot themselves in the foot on that. We expect the Labour Party to try and mend a few fences. We'll have to see how that goes. British imperialism is still a very strong imperialist power. However, it's not as strong as the United States, and like all the imperialists, they're in difficulties, partly because of economic crisis, partly because their ability to freely go and loot any country they liked has been reduced as a result of China offering people fair terms for trade, so countries are no longer forced to accept the terms that imperialism is offering them. So all of that is causing trouble for imperialism, and the British government seem to think that the best way of protecting themselves is to keep close to America and hope for some protection from them. Anyone who keeps close to America hoping for protection needs his head examined, personally, I think. But that's a strategy, and this is why the British governments just more or less take their orders from the United States, even when it's embarrassing for them.
Maybe concerning the Ukraine war, so British imperialism in contrast to the German government, German imperialism is very more aggressive in its support for Ukraine. We have the example of sending far-reaching weapons, also being the first every time who says, yeah, of course, Ukraine is allowed to use our far-reaching weapons to also attack direct territory of Russia, for example. So at least as we are understanding it, many explain this behavior with the more openly imperial self-image of British imperialism coming from the colonial area, but others with much closer ties to the US compared to Germans' relations and to the US imperialism. So how would you assess this behavior of the UK government or the ruling class?
Yeah, they're just doing what the Americans demand. That's what all it is. In fact, it's quite useful because the British can do certain things that the Americans possibly might not be able to. But there's also the geographical question. You know, if the Third World War breaks out, Germany is much closer to the action than we are. But all the same, I think it's foolhardy behaviour. British population certainly won't like it if bombs start dropping on London, and they will if they carry on like this.
This is a topic also discussed in the public, so either in media, maybe not. You can elaborate on that, but is it a discussion in the population? I mean,
no,
not at all.
Not as far as I'm aware of. I mean, it's very difficult to know where to discuss. There is discussion, of course, online, and people listen to podcasts and all that sort of thing. But in terms of the original population, places where you can go and talk to people generally, they're closed down. And in the old days, we used to be able to go down to the pub and have a good discussion with people. But now all the pubs have music so loud that you can't hear yourself think. So the pub is no longer a place where you can do anything except drink. So basically there would have to be some sort of a lead from the media for people to have an interest in these things, or alternatively the communists getting out there and talking to people about it. And then it's of course going to the demonstrations and then raising these questions with people who've already begun to be interested. That's all it can be, but it's a very, very much a minority of the population, I would think.
So what do you say it's also, because in Germany, since the war in Ukraine started, we had this big militarization going on. There was more funding of the military, but also on the public display and in the discussions, like the population is prepared to go to war. And we see that, I mean, there are a lot of people who are against sending weapons, but we also see that there are a lot of people who start to be okay with the idea of going to war with Russia.
I doubt whether they'd be okay of personally going into Russia and fighting. And I think, I don't know, it's a feeling that I have that if you look at the First World War, There was a huge enthusiasm for the young men to join up and go and do our bit. But I think that if they tried to get people to fight, conscripts to fight a war, the Third World War, I don't think anyone would volunteer. And, if you try and mobilise people who won't volunteer, then they turn out to be not very good soldiers. I honestly think there'd be huge public hostility to our people participating in a hot war against an enemy that's able to hit back. I mean, it's one thing to send them to Afghanistan where the enemy is perceived as not being able to hit back. Of course they did. But Russia is a much bigger fish than Afghanistan, and I think people will say, well, why would we want to go and cause trouble there? If anything brings the working class to revolution in this country, I think war would be it, like it was in Russia. People made revolution because the demands of the war were too hard on the people. They couldn't live. So they were ripe for revolution. And again, in this country, if anyone actually expects us to conduct a war in which we're part of the theatre of the war, as opposed to dropping bombs on countries far away who can't defend themselves. So they're quite happy with that. But it's altogether different fighting a country that can and does defend itself. And I don't think there'd be any popular support for entering an enterprise of that kind.
But to send those far-reaching weapons to Ukraine, there still is a lot of public support, or people just don't care that much?
No.
Because it seems far away.
Yeah, there was a lot of pro-Ukraine propaganda, and there still is. So, most people have no reason to question the propaganda, and they assume they're being told the truth by the media. And, so there was a lot of sentimentality over Ukraine, blue and yellow flags everywhere, and, people volunteering to put up the families who came over here and all the rest of it. Interestingly, on the question of Palestine and sending arms to Israel, I was just reading that there's a poll that shows the majority of British think that arms should not be sent to Israel. So, I mean, at least there they can see with their own eyes, my God, well, I really don't want my bombs to be blowing up little children. But on Ukraine, I don't think there's the same level of consciousness. I mean, for instance, as I understand it, the Communist Party of Britain, which is more or less all right on Palestine, still says that Russia is the aggressor in the war against in Ukraine. So I don't think there's the same level of consciousness. But no, I was just thinking that in terms of the genocide in Gaza, I mean, we were all brought up with the horrors of the Holocaust against the Jews. And the result is we can recognize a genocide when we see it. When we see it on our television screens, but even when we see the Palestinians before this latest war being denied their housing and having their homes blown up and being deprived of their farms and all the rest of it, we could sort of see the parallels with Hitler Germany and what was done to the Jews. And, you can't really... We've been thoroughly prepared by the bourgeoisie itself to recognise a genocide when we see it. So it's really not surprising that people feel quite differently about Palestine. But what's good is that the consciousness is deepening now, and people are getting much more knowledgeable about the whole situation. Of course, people were upset about what happened to the Jews, and you didn't want to have them to continue to suffer. And of course Palestine was presented as the place where they'd all be safe. But their behaviour was such that far from being safe, that's probably the most dangerous place for Jews in the world. They would be much better off in America. They'd be perfectly welcome to come here. But there you are.
I just have an additional question regarding the Ukraine war. Obviously, you oppose the support of the British government for the Ukraine war and sending weapons. But is there any right-wing party, for example, also opposing the support of the Ukraine war? This is a little bit,
Yeah,
I don't know, maybe it's special
Yeah, that's
for
a bit
Germany,
technical.
but there is the right-wing party AfD. They at least say that they are opposing the war
Yeah.
against
In words, I
Ukraine.
mean, they're huge
words,
on
yeah,
militarism as well.
It's important to mention they are still pro-militarization and pro-German militarization, imperialism, sorry.
Well, of course,
I just was interested in if you have the troubles also in separating from right-wing organizations in this particular questions.
Yeah, I mean, the right wing popularizes itself by taking up those matters which are of interest to the working class and in a way to keep them away from the communists. But of course there's a difference between the communists and the right wing when they adopt these slogans, is that the communists can be trusted to implement them, whereas you can be pretty sure that the right wing won't. But in terms of the propaganda they're putting out, very often, as compared to the Social Democrats, the fascists are looking, or the extreme right wing, but perhaps they're not fascists in the present context, it's wrong to call them that, but the extreme right wing is looking positively progressive. So, it's almost like saying that the right has become the new left. I mean, in areas where the Social Democrats really make fools of themselves, like on identity politics and the rights of transgenders, and so that everyone can change their sex if they want to, and all that kind of thing, which ordinary workers are obviously going to think ridiculous. But the whole of the social democratic movement is falling for it and getting involved in all that kind of thing. And it's a wonderful opportunity for the right wing to be able to say, well, facts are facts, and to make the left, which includes the communists, look ridiculous, even those communists who certainly don't take those ridiculous positions. So, but perhaps people don't realise that in many ways the Social Democrats are pretty well as dangerous as the fascists. I mean, the history of Germany shows that the Social Democrats really paved the way for the fascists. They would rather have had a fascist government than a communist one, and that's what tends to happen. So it's very difficult.
Do you have any additional questions?
I think for this topic, no. Maybe if I would add another question, because I think we're okay with the time.
Yeah.
But it would be for another topic, so you have to say if it's okay. Because now it was the 20th anniversary of the CPGB-ML, and you also told us that you have been active in the movement long before, and maybe it would be interesting to know a little bit more of the origins of CPGB-ML, also the Indian Workers Association. It's closely okay, but if it's too much, it's okay.
It's probably a little bit too much, but I can give you the outline of it. That basically, at the time of the split in the international communist movement, when China and Russia were at each other's throats, our little group, and we were a very little group, was of the opinion that the Chinese criticisms of Khrushchev's policy were correct. And therefore, basically, we sided with the Maoists against the official communist movement, which had all gone along with Khrushchev's speeches and Khrushchev's policies of the peaceful road to socialism and all that nonsense. And so the people who were prepared to stick by their basic Marxist principles were left the revisionist organisations, and then they tried to form another organisation, but they were all quarrelling over them with each other over everything, and there was also a huge suspicion at that time, because here was this great, solid, massive communist organization in the great Soviet Union, and it had gone revisionist in a way which to any Marxist was pretty obvious that they were making serious mistakes. And people would ask themselves, how could that happen? Such a powerful party, how could it take these positions? What's happened? And so everyone was terribly suspicious of everybody else. This whole idea that people would worm their way into the party to bring in incorrect policies, and so it gave rise to a fear of uniting with anyone with whom you had the slightest disagreement. If you had a disagreement over what the best breakfast food was, you couldn't be in the same party. So there were these tiny little organizations which all split over very minor things. If you've ever seen the film The Life of Brian, well, that was us. That was us at the time. Thanks to the Indian Workers' Association, where basically the Indians were unable, it was formed by Indians unable to find a communist party that was sufficiently communist for their purposes. They had this Indian Workers' Association which was with a mass base. They could hold huge meetings and hold huge demonstrations, and they were prepared to work with us, and that gave us a little bit of kudos and also good experience. And then towards the end of the last century, Arthur Scargill finally decided, he was the big miners' leader, finally decided that the Labour Party was going nowhere and decided to form his own party. We thought this was wonderful because Arthur Scargill was a really strong union leader, and we thought the combination of his leadership and his determination and of course his following, combine it with communist thinking, and you'd have something really good. And so he formed this Socialist Labour Party, and because we had a mass following with the Indian Workers' Association, he was prepared to work with us, and we joined. And then, it turned out that Arthur Scargill was very stubborn in sticking to such principles as, I believe in unilateral disarmament, therefore North Korea shouldn't have a nuclear weapon, and things of that nature. And the Socialist Labour Party was set up in such a way that Arthur and the people close to him controlled the votes of the unions that were affiliated, basically the mining unions. So they had a massive number of votes compared to anyone else. Arthur could outvote anybody on anything. And it's quite good at the time. We started the women's movement. We had a newspaper, Women for Socialism, that was very popular, and we were able to do quite a lot of work. And but what came to a head was the question of Korea. As it happened, we'd done quite a lot of work on Korea, and we knew what we were talking about. And Korea at the time was under heavy pressure from imperialism, and it was developing a nuclear weapon because it needed to defend itself against attack. And we obviously said, they've got every right to defend themselves against attack. Nuclear disarmament is, yes, we should, but it shouldn't. It should be unilateral for the aggressors. It should be unilateral for the imperialists, but not for small people trying to defend themselves. And there was a Congress at which a resolution came up to that effect, that we should be supporting North Korea and its right to defend itself by whatever means, including nuclear weapons. And Arthur, of course, opposed that, and much to his astonishment, he lost the vote. He lost the vote largely because he forgot to use his union vote. But it became the official policy of the party, you see. Anyway, and he was so upset by it all that somebody later put forward a resolution that we should support the tenants' organisations to defend public housing, council housing, and he voted against it. he just completely disoriented by the whole thing. Anyway, very shortly after that, we found ourselves thrown out. I was personally expelled. But when we were expelled, then there were a lot of members who came with us. You know, people we only had dealings with while we were party members, people who'd never been part of our party. First of all, you know, were shocked by the bureaucratic way that we were expelled. And they didn't see the need for it. And they came with us, and there was sufficient of them to form the basis of the party that we have today. But of course, then, as you heard, we had some ding-dongs after that, and which is inevitable as you grow a party, that there will, the bourgeois propaganda obviously affects all party members and will create differences between us that we have to struggle to overcome.
Yeah.
So there was the question of immigration, which was the big one, and then after that there was IDPOL. We had a few people leave us because of IDPOL. But it's always been a tiny minority, because we have congresses where these matters are thoroughly discussed. If something's controversial within the party and as serious as that, then the Congress, people have a year of preparation to submit written positions on that they want to defend and all the rest of it, and we make sure that there is the most thorough investigation, the most thorough right to speak, and it's the communist principle that you have internally the greatest discussion, but then a decision is made and the minority must abide by the majority. And it's a process that I think normally would bring out the right answer. I mean, if you've actually attended the congresses where these important issues have been discussed, you'd be astonished at the quality of the argumentation, the quality of the debate. Amazing. I've never seen anything like it elsewhere. Your university debates, your legal debates, or whatever. They've never been of the quality of the debates within our party on these important issues. There was also the Scottish nationalism, whether Scotland was a nation or not. That was also very controversial. But when you do your homework, poor old Scotland's not a nation, but it's a region of Britain which has got some of its own characteristics, but every region of Britain has its own characteristics, so it doesn't mean anything very much. But basically the Scots were very happy to join with Britain in looting the world, and they were never discriminated against. We've had any number of Scottish prime ministers, for instance. So there we are. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So we shall have to take our revenge and come back to Germany and cross-examine you about the German movement, shan't we?
You're very welcome.
Kommunistische Organisation. Podcast.